Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the vast, snow-dusted wilderness of the early American frontier, a time when the Rocky Mountains stood silent and immense, and men ventured into their frozen hearts seeking beaver pelts, solitude, and something they could barely name. This is a journey through blood, ice, and timber, through the lives of the mountain men who carved their existence into a landscape that asked for everything and promised nothing in return. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Perhaps you're nestled in bed as darkness gathers outside your window, or maybe the first light of dawn is just beginning to soften the horizon. Wherever you are, whatever hour has brought you here, you're welcome in this quiet space. Now, let's prepare for this gentle journey together. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head against your pillow and feel its cool surface warm beneath you. Allow your breathing to soften, each exhale carrying away a little more of the day's tension. Feel your shoulders drop, your jaw relax, your eyelids grow pleasantly heavy. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. There's no urgency, no pressure. Just you, me, and the slow unfolding of history's quieter moments. Let's begin. Let me share with you the story of how a man might decide to leave everything behind. It's 1823, and the docks of St. Louis smell of river mud, tobacco, and something else. Possibility, maybe, or desperation wearing possibility's coat. Our story centers on a young man named Thomas Bridger, though everyone calls him Jim, and he's 17 years old with calloused hands and a hunger that has nothing to do with his stomach. Jim has just signed on with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a venture led by a man named William Ashley who places advertisements in newspapers promising adventure and fortune. The ads read like invitations to another world, and for young men stuck in the muddy streets of frontier towns, that other world sounds better than the one they're leaving. Jim can barely read those advertisements, but he doesn't need to. He's heard the stories, beaver pelts worth their weight in coins, mountains that touch the clouds, rivers so clear you can see every stone on their beds. Before he leaves, Jim's mother packs him a small cloth bundle. Inside, wrapped carefully, are 3 precious items: a comb she carved from bone, a letter written in her careful hand that he'll never be able to read fully, and a small cake of maple sugar wrapped in waxed paper. That maple sugar, pressed and hardened, represents her entire sugar ration for a month. In 1823, such sugar was expensive, shipped up the Mississippi from New Orleans, where it arrived from Caribbean plantations. Each bite of that sweetness costs more than most families can afford for casual eating. Jim tucks it into his possible bag, that leather pouch every mountain man carries, and promises himself he'll only taste it on the hardest days. The Missouri River stretches before the expedition like a brown serpent, and the keelboats that will carry them upstream are loaded with supplies: gunpowder, lead for bullets, traps for beaver, and food. So much food, or what passes for it. There are barrels of salt pork, so thoroughly preserved in brine that it must be soaked for hours before cooking or it'll burn your throat with salt. There are sacks of cornmeal, which will become the thick, filling mush called hominy that trappers eat morning and night. And there are bags of something Jim has never seen before: pemmican, purchased from Indian traders. This strange food is a mixture of dried buffalo meat, pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat and sometimes wild berries. It looks like nothing appetizing, but the old hands tell him it's what'll keep him alive when winter closes its fist around the mountains. Pemmican was invented by the Plains tribes centuries before European contact, a food so efficient and long-lasting that it would later be copied by Arctic explorers. 1 pound of pemmican could sustain a man for an entire day of hard travel. The keelboat pulls against the Missouri's current, and the rhythm becomes Jim's whole world. The splash of poles, the grunt of men pushing, the slow crawl upstream. At night, they camp on muddy banks and the smell of salt pork frying in skillets drifts through the cottonwood trees. Jim watches the older men, trying to learn their ease, their casual competence. One of them, a French-Canadian voyageur named Baptiste, shows him how to make boudin blanc, a type of sausage the French trappers favor. You take the intestines of whatever animal you've killed, clean them thoroughly in river water, then stuff them with a mixture of meat, fat, and whatever wild onions you can find. Twisted and tied, cooked over coals, it's surprisingly delicate. The casing snaps when you bite it, releasing warm, savory fat. Baptiste tells him that back in Montreal, proper boudin blanc is made with cream and delicate spices, but out here, you make do with what the land provides. There's something comforting about this part of the story, isn't there? The way food becomes ritual, becomes connection. Jim sits with these strangers who are becoming companions, and they share grease-stained fingers and stories that grow taller as the fire burns lower. 3 months into the journey, they reach the Yellowstone River, and Jim tastes his first beaver tail. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy among mountain men, and not just for novelty. The tail is almost entirely fat, and in a wilderness where calories mean survival, fat is precious as gold. To prepare it, you first char the thick, scaly skin over direct flame until it bubbles and cracks, then peel it away to reveal pale, fatty meat underneath. Roasted slowly, it develops a rich, oily flavor somewhere between pork and fish. French voyageurs insisted it wasn't meat at all but fish, which meant they could eat it on Catholic fast days. The church, pragmatic about frontier survival, largely looked the other way. Jim thinks it tastes like survival and smoke. He eats it slowly, making it last, and Baptiste laughs at the concentration on his face. They push deeper into the mountains as summer fades. The keelboats are left behind, replaced by horses and mules. The landscape changes. Rolling plains give way to foothills, foothills to mountains that seem to scrape the sky itself. The air grows thinner, colder, even in September. Jim's lungs burn with effort, and at night, frost forms on his blanket even though he's sleeping close to the fire. This is when he finally unwraps his mother's maple sugar. It's a bad day. His feet are bleeding in his boots, his shoulders ache from carrying his rifle and possible bag, and they've seen no game for 2 days, which means dinner is cold cornmeal mush and water. He breaks off a tiny piece of the maple cake and lets it dissolve on his tongue. The sweetness is startling, almost painful in its intensity. For a moment, he's back in St. Louis, in the small room behind the boarding house where his mother works, and she's humming while she mends shirts by candlelight. Then the moment passes, and he's back in the mountains with darkness gathering and wolves howling in the distance. The Ashley expedition is heading for the Bighorn River, where they'll establish a base camp for the winter's trapping season. William Ashley is gambling everything on this venture: his reputation, his fortune, his life. The year before, in 1822, a similar expedition ended in disaster when Iroquois Indians attacked a party of trappers, killing 13 men. Ashley is hoping this year will be different, that by pushing deeper into the mountains, they'll find both safety and beaver-rich streams. Jim learns to trap that autumn, wading into ice-cold water to set steel traps at the entrance to beaver lodges. The water numbs his legs within minutes, and he learns to work fast, his fingers clumsy with cold as he stakes the traps chained to the stream bed and masks his scent by rubbing his hands with beaver castor, a musky secretion trappers call medicine. The first time he checks his trap line and finds a beaver caught, drowned by the trap's weight, he feels a complicated mixture of triumph and something else, something like guilt. But beaver pelts are worth $5 each in St. Louis, and $5 is more money than he's ever held at once. As your body relaxes deeper, imagine the cold of that mountain stream, the way it would make your feet ache and then go numb, the strange relief of that numbness. Imagine the weight of wet buckskin trousers, the smell of wood smoke permanently embedded in wool shirts, the particular tiredness that comes from physical labor at high altitude where every breath brings less oxygen than your body expects. Winter comes early in the Rockies. By October, snow is falling in earnest, transforming the landscape into something alien and absolute. The trappers build rough shelters, log lean-tos chinked with mud and moss, and settle in for months of cold and isolation. They'll trap until the streams freeze solid, then retreat to winter camps to wait for spring. Jim's education continues through that first winter. He learns to make moccasins from elk hide, sewing them with sinew and buffalo hair. He learns to keep his powder dry, to start a fire in wind and snow, to read weather in the behavior of animals. He learns that hunger has stages. First it's an ache, then an obsession, then a kind of hollow clarity. And he learns what the old hands already know, that the wilderness will kill you efficiently if you give it the slightest opportunity, but it will also show you things so beautiful they hurt to witness. Sunrises that paint the snow rose and gold, the absolute silence after a heavy snowfall, the way a frozen waterfall becomes blue ice cathedral. They celebrate Christmas with a feast, or what passes for a feast. Someone has shot an elk, so there's fresh meat instead of salt pork. They make a kind of pudding from cornmeal, dried service berries, and precious sugar mixed with melted snow and elk bone marrow. It's grainy and strange, but it's sweet, and sweetness is rare enough to make it wonderful. Someone has a harmonica, and they pass it around, each man playing the few songs he knows while the others listen. Jim thinks about his mother and wonders if she's thinking about him, if she imagines where he is and what he's doing. He hopes she can't imagine it too clearly. He wouldn't want her to worry. And now, allow your mind to float gently into the next chapter. As your breathing continues its slow, steady rhythm, let's follow Jim Bridger deeper into his first mountain winter. It's January of 1824 now, and the cold has achieved a quality that feels almost personal in its hostility. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. Temperature scales as we know them today weren't standardized yet in the American frontier, so mountain men described cold in terms of its effects rather than degrees. They spoke of one blanket cold, or three-dog night, based on how many dogs you needed in your bedroll for warmth, or the cold that made trees explode, when the sap in pine trees froze so solid the wood split with sounds like rifle shots. Jim wakes one morning to find his beard frozen to his blanket, his breath crystallized on the wool. This is what the voyagers call poudre blanche, white powder, when your breath freezes instantly and falls like snow. He's sharing a shelter with Baptiste and another trapper named Hugh Glass, who's at least 40 and seems ancient to Jim's 18 years. Glass has a reputation for surviving things that should kill a man, and his body bears the scars to prove it. Knife marks, healed over bullet wounds, a set of parallel scars across his back that he never explains. Breakfast this morning is something the French trappers call roubabou, and Jim has learned to tolerate if not exactly enjoy it. You take some pemmican, break it into small pieces, and simmer it in water with whatever else you have. In this case, some wild onions dug from beneath the snow and a handful of flour to thicken the mixture. It becomes a kind of stew, greasy and filling, with the wild onions providing a sharp bite that almost disguises the taste of old fat. The French voyageurs have been making roubabou since the 1700s, a recipe born from necessity when traveling the Canadian waterways. It's the kind of food that isn't about pleasure but about fuel, about staying alive. Glass looks at Jim across the pot and says, "Boy, you're learning what your body can tolerate. That's the most important education out here. Not how to shoot straight or read signs, though those matter, but knowing how much cold you can take, how much hunger, how much fear before you break." Jim nods, scraping the last of the roubabou from his tin cup. His hands are developing thick calluses, and his nails are broken and black from repeated frostbite. He barely recognizes these hands as his own. The trapping continues through January whenever the weather allows. The streams are freezing solid now, which means wading into water that can kill you in minutes if you slip and soak yourself completely. Jim learns to work faster, his movements efficient from repetition. He's catching beaver regularly now, and the growing stack of pelts represents something more than money. It's proof that he belongs here, that he's becoming the thing he wanted to be when he left St. Louis. One afternoon, checking his furthest trap, Jim spots something unusual, a set of tracks in the snow that make him stop completely. They're human tracks, made by moccasins, but the stride is wrong, too wide, and they're heading toward the trapper's camp. He follows them carefully, keeping his rifle ready, and eventually he finds the track maker, a young Crow woman, barely older than himself, checking her own trap line on the same creek. They stare at each other across 30 yards of snow and moving water, and Jim realizes she's as startled as he is. The Crow people have been in these mountains for generations. Some anthropologists believe they split from the Hidatsa tribe around 1700, migrating westward into the Yellowstone region where they developed a sophisticated culture based on buffalo hunting and seasonal migration. They know this landscape in ways Jim is only beginning to understand, reading it like a familiar book while he's still learning the alphabet. The young woman, Jim will later learn her name is Pine Leaf, relaxes slightly when she sees he's not reaching for his rifle. She shows him her catch, 2 beavers, and makes a gesture that seems to ask about him. He walks to his nearest trap and pulls it, finding it empty. She laughs, a sound like water over stones, and makes a gesture he interprets as better luck next time. Then she's gone, moving through the forest with a silence he can only envy. That night, back at camp, he tells the others about the encounter. Baptiste nods knowingly. "The Crow are good people," he says. "They don't love white men, but they don't usually kill us either. The Blackfeet now, they're different. They'll kill you for looking at them wrong." Lost 2 friends to Blackfeet in 1820. Hugh Glass is making something Jim has never seen before, something Glass calls trapper's butter. You take bone marrow, preferably from elk or buffalo, and render it slowly over low heat until the fat separates and clarifies. Then you add salt if you have it, maybe some wild herbs, and store it in a tin or leather pouch. Spread on hard biscuits or cornmeal cakes. It provides concentrated calories and a rich, savory satisfaction. The marrow fat, Glass explains, is the best part of any animal, worth more than the meat in some ways because fat is what keeps you warm from the inside out. Indigenous peoples across North America had been making various forms of rendered bone marrow fat for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, understanding intuitively what nutritionists would later confirm, that fat is essential for survival in extreme cold. Jim watches Glass work, the careful way he tends the fire to keep it from getting too hot and burning the marrow. There's something almost meditative about it, this careful transformation of raw material into sustenance. Glass spreads some of the finished product on a piece of hardtack, that tooth-breaking biscuit that's a staple of frontier life, and hands it to Jim. The marrow butter soaks into the hard bread, softening it, filling Jim's mouth with rich, slightly gamey flavor. "This'll keep you alive when nothing else will," Glass says. Remember that. February brings what the voyagers call la misère, the misery. It's a stretch of weather so cold and persistent that even moving around camp becomes dangerous. They burn through firewood faster than they can cut it, and someone has to venture out every day into knee-deep snow to drag back dead timber. Jim takes his turn, and the work leaves him exhausted and dizzy from lack of oxygen at this altitude. Food becomes an obsession during La Misère. They've been eating the same things for months now: salt pork, cornmeal, pemmican, dried service berries on special occasions, and the monotony becomes its own kind of hunger. Jim finds himself dreaming about food with an intensity that surprises him. Not the maple sugar from his mother, though he's long since eaten the last of it, but stranger things. He dreams about eggs fried in butter, about fresh bread with strawberry preserves, about a peach pie his mother made once for a boarding house guest's birthday, the syrup running down the crust. Baptiste, noticing Jim's distraction, tells him about the feasts they have in Montreal during winter: tourtière, a savory meat pie made with pork and veal and spices, served with thick pickles and mustard; or ragoût de pâtes, a stew of pig's feet and meatballs in brown sauce that cooks all day and fills the house with smell. Baptiste describes these dishes with such detail that Jim can almost taste them, almost smell them, and for a moment, the cold shelter feels warmer just from the imagination. "Food is memory," Baptiste says. "Out here we eat to survive. But remembering good food, that's how we stay human. That's how we remember there's more to life than beaver pelts and cold." One morning in late February, Jim wakes to find Hugh Glass gone. His bedroll is there, his gear, but Glass himself has vanished. The other trappers search the immediate area, worried that he's wandered off in the night in some kind of cold-induced delirium, but they find no tracks leading away from the shelter. It's only at noon, when the sun has risen as high as it will get in winter, that Glass reappears, walking into camp from downstream with something in his possible bag. He's found a bee tree. Even in winter, Glass explains, if you know what to look for, you can find wild honey. The bees are dormant, clustered deep in a hollow tree for warmth, and their honey stores are accessible if you're careful and willing to do the work. Glass has chopped into a dead cottonwood and extracted perhaps a pint of honey, dark, crystallized, but real honey. Wild honey from bees that fed on wildflowers Jim has never seen, from blooms that come in spring to these mountain meadows. They divide the honey carefully, each man getting perhaps a tablespoon. Jim takes his portion on his finger and lets it melt on his tongue slowly, so slowly, making it last as long as possible. The sweetness is complex, floral and slightly bitter, nothing like refined sugar. It tastes like summer stored in liquid form, like proof that warmth and growing things exist somewhere beyond this endless white cold. Wild honey has been prized by humans for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence shows honey harvesting dating back at least 8,000 years. The ancient Greeks called it the nectar of the gods. And here, in this frozen mountain shelter in 1824, Jim understands why. That tiny spoonful of honey shifts something in Jim's mind. It's proof that the world beyond winter still exists, that spring will eventually come, that there are still surprises and sweetnesses to be found even in the hardest times. He thinks about telling his mother about this moment, if he ever sees her again, how a tablespoon of wild honey in the middle of a Rocky Mountain winter felt like the greatest gift he'd ever received. March arrives slowly, bringing with it subtle signs of change. The quality of light shifts, lasting a few minutes longer each day. The snow begins to consolidate, developing a crust that can almost hold a man's weight in the morning before it softens in the afternoon sun. And the animals begin to move, elk descending from the highest peaks, wolves following, the whole pattern of life reasserting itself after winter's suspension. The trappers emerge from their shelters more frequently, stretching their stiff bodies, checking trap lines with renewed energy. Jim has survived his first mountain winter, and he feels fundamentally changed by it, shaped by cold and hunger and isolation into something harder and leaner than what arrived from St. Louis 9 months ago. One evening, as the light fades to purple and the first stars appear, Baptiste makes a special meal to celebrate survival. He's been hoarding ingredients for weeks: a bit of flour, some dried wild plums, a precious cup of sugar traded from another trapping party they encountered in January. He makes something he calls beignets, a French pastry fried in hot fat. They're small and irregular, fried in rendered bare fat in a skillet, then dusted with the sugar while still hot. Jim bites into one and tastes sweetness, oil, the slight tang of wild plums Baptiste has kneaded into the dough. It's crisp on the outside, soft within, and so far removed from rhubarb and salt pork that it feels like food from another world. "My grandmère made these every Sunday," Baptiste says quietly. "She would make hundreds, and all the children in the neighborhood would come to our door. I haven't tasted them in 15 years. They eat in silence, these men who've survived winter together, and Jim understands that he's part of something now, some brotherhood of cold and distance. He belongs to the mountains in a way he can't quite articulate, and the mountains, for all their casual cruelty, have accepted him. As your mind drifts, feeling the warmth of those beignets, the sweetness of that wild honey, let your consciousness float gently toward the next chapter. Spring arrives in the mountains not as a single event but as a series of small surrenders. First, the southern slopes lose their snow, revealing brown grass flattened by winter's weight. Then, the creeks begin to run louder, fed by meltwater that turns them from their winter whisper to a robust churn. The aspens, bare since October, develop a subtle green haze as buds swell along their white branches. And the smell. The whole world begins to smell different, like earth and growth and the peculiar perfume of pine sap warming in increasing sunshine. It's April of 1824, and Jim Bridger is checking his trap line through slush and mud, his moccasins soaked through and his feet squelching with each step. But he's smiling because warm, wet feet are infinitely preferable to frozen ones, and because the beaver are moving again, active after winter, and his traps are producing well. He's also smiling because word has reached their camp about the rendezvous. Let me share with you about the rendezvous system, because it shaped the Rocky Mountain fur trade for decades. William Ashley, the entrepreneur who organized Jim's expedition, invented this system in 1825 as an alternative to building permanent trading posts. Instead of trappers bringing their furs back to civilization, civilization would come to them. Once a year, a supply caravan would travel from St. Louis into the mountains, meeting the trappers at a predetermined location. There, trappers would trade their year's catch for supplies, equipment, and trade goods. But the rendezvous became more than a business transaction. It became the social event of the year, a wild combination of market, reunion, and prolonged celebration. The first official rendezvous will be next year, in 1825, but already the mountain men are gathering informally, drawn together after winter's isolation. The meeting place is Cache Valley, in what will eventually become northern Utah, a vast meadow surrounded by mountains with good water, plentiful grass for horses, and enough game to feed hundreds of men for weeks. Jim's party breaks camp in late May, packing their winter's catch, over 300 beaver pelts, soft and supple, each one representing hours of cold work. The pelts are bundled into 90-pound packs that will be loaded onto pack mules for the journey to Cache Valley. Jim has 32 pelts of his own, which means he's earned $160, more money than he's ever possessed. Of course, by the time he's paid back his account for supplies, paid for next year's equipment, and bought necessities, most of that money will evaporate. But still, for now, he's rich in possibility. The journey to Cache Valley takes 2 weeks through the country so beautiful it makes Jim's chest ache. They follow elk trails through forests of lodgepole pine, cross meadows filled with wildflowers, blue lupin, red paintbrush, yellow mule's ears. The horses grow fat on the good grass, and the men's spirits lift with each mile traveled. They're heading toward people, toward conversation and competition and all the social interactions they've been missing for months. They smell the rendezvous before they see it, wood smoke and roasting meat and the unmistakable scent of hundreds of humans and horses in one place. Then they crest a ridge and Cache Valley spreads below them, and Jim stops his horse to stare. There are at least 300 people scattered across the meadow, white trappers, French-Canadian voyagers, Spanish traders from New Mexico, and various Indian tribes, primarily Shoshone and Flathead, with a few Utes and Nez Perce. Lodges and lean-tos and canvas tents create a temporary city, with cook fires smoking and horses grazing in scattered herds and people moving between camps in constant motion. Baptiste, riding beside Jim, grins widely. Voilà mon ami. This is what we worked all winter for. Not the money, but this. People. They ride down into the valley and the rendezvous absorbs them. The first order of business is trading with the supply caravan that's arrived from St. Louis, exchanging pelts for credit, then using that credit to buy necessities. Jim needs new traps to replace ones lost to floods and frozen springs. He needs powder and lead, coffee and tobacco, a new skinning knife because he broke in March. He watches his credit account shrink with each purchase, but he's pragmatic about it. These things keep him alive, so they're worth what they cost. But the rendezvous isn't just about commerce. It's about every kind of excess after a year of deprivation. There's whiskey, raw and harsh, traded at outrageous prices, sometimes $5 for a pint that would cost 20 cents in St. Louis. There's gambling, with men betting their entire year's earnings on hand games, card games, shooting contests, horse races. And there's food, so much food, such variety after months of monotony. The Shoshone women are cooking every night, and Jim discovers entirely new categories of cuisine. There's a kind of biscuit made from camas root, a plant that grows in the mountain meadows and produces bulbs that, when baked in pit ovens for 24 hours, become sweet and tender. The Shoshone have been processing camas for thousands of years, developing the technique of slow pit roasting that converts the root's indigestible inulin into fructose. The resulting cakes taste something like sweet potato crossed with pear, and Jim eats them with astonishment. How had he not known such food existed? There's also serviceberry pudding, made from dried berries pounded into flour, mixed with water and a bit of fat, and cooked into something almost cake-like. And there's what the Shoshone call bow, dried salmon brought from the Columbia River region through trade networks that span hundreds of miles. The salmon is hard as wood, but soaked in water and then roasted over coals, it softens and develops a rich, smoky flavor that's unlike anything Jim has tasted. Pacific salmon have been a staple food source for indigenous peoples of the Northwest for over 10,000 years, and the dried fish traveled far through intertribal trade, making it available even to mountain dwellers hundreds of miles from the ocean. Jim eats constantly during those first days at rendezvous, making up for winter's privation. He tries everything offered to him, strips of roasted elk, seasoned with wild herbs he can't identify, fried fish from the streams, something called prairie turnips, small tubers that taste like a cross between potatoes and chestnuts. And one evening at a flathead camp, he tries something truly unusual: ant eggs. They're collected from anthills in early summer when the eggs are plump, then roasted quickly over high heat until they pop like tiny grains of corn. The taste is nutty and slightly tangy, and while Jim isn't sure he'd seek them out, he admits they're better than salt pork. Ant larvae and pupae have been consumed by various cultures worldwide for millennia. The ancient Greeks and Romans considered them a delicacy, and many indigenous American groups harvested them seasonally. There's something comforting about this part of the story, isn't there? The way the rendezvous becomes a temporary suspension of the wilderness's harshness, a reminder that humans are social creatures who need gathering, need feasting, need the particular kind of joy that comes from sharing food and stories and laughter. Jim spends an afternoon at a shooting competition, watching the best marksmen among the trappers compete for a prize, a Hudson Bay trade musket, worth about $30. The competition is fierce, with men shooting at increasingly distant targets, trying to place bullets through playing cards nailed to trees. Jim doesn't enter. He's good with a rifle, but not competition-level good, but he admires the skill on display. These men can shoot with a precision that seems almost supernatural, hitting targets at distances that make Jim squint to even see them clearly. In the evening, there's dancing to fiddle music, and Jim, who's never been good at dancing, stands at the edge of the crowd and watches. Mountain men dance with each other in absence of enough women, twirling each other around with surprising grace. Some of the voyageurs dance in the French style, their feet moving in complex patterns while their upper bodies remain almost still. And some of the younger men dance with Shoshone women, tentative and shy, trying to bridge the gap of language and culture with movement. Jim thinks about Pine Leaf, the crow woman he met on the trapline in January, and wonders if she's somewhere in this gathering. The Crow aren't friendly with all the tribes present. There's old tension with the Shoshone, some dispute about hunting territories, so maybe she's not here. But he scans the crowd anyway, looking for her face. One afternoon, Baptiste takes Jim to meet a legend, a man named Jedediah Smith who's only 25 but already famous among the mountain men. Smith has survived a grizzly bear attack that nearly scalped him, has crossed the Great Salt Lake Desert when most men said it was impossible, and has a reputation for fairness and competence that's rare in this rough world. They find Smith at his camp, and Jim is surprised by what he sees. Smith looks scholarly, almost delicate, with his neat clothing and the Bible he keeps in his possible bag. But his eyes are different, alert and assessing in a way that makes Jim understand this is a man who misses nothing. Smith shares his evening meal with them, a stew of elk meat and wild onions, thickened with flour, served with fried bread. The bread, called bannock, is a staple among trappers. Simple flour, water, salt, and a bit of baking powder if you're fortunate enough to have it, fried in fat until golden. It's dense and filling, and Jim uses it to sop up the rich stew gravy. Bannock has Scottish origins, brought to North America by fur traders employed by the Hudson's Bay Company and adopted enthusiastically by trappers and indigenous peoples alike. By the 1820s, it had become ubiquitous across the frontier, one of those cultural borrowings that moves so seamlessly between groups that its origins become blurred. Smith talks while they eat, discussing routes and beaver populations and the political situation with various tribes. Jim mostly listens, absorbing information, learning that being a successful mountain man requires more than skill with traps and rifles. You need to understand tribal politics, trade networks, weather patterns, geography on a scale most people never consider. Smith carries this knowledge lightly, but Jim can sense its weight, the years of careful observation that inform every statement Smith makes. After they've eaten, Smith brings out something special, dried apples, brought from Missouri. They've been dried so thoroughly they're leathery and dark, barely recognizable as apples, but when you bite into one and chew slowly, the flavor concentrates and blooms. Jim closes his eyes and tastes autumn orchards, remembers the smell of apple pie baking, remembers being 7 years old and stealing a still warm apple from a neighbor's tree. That dried apple slice, barely the size of his thumb, carries so much memory and sweetness that he has to blink back unexpected emotion. Apples, Smith says quietly, noticing Jim's reaction. They're more valuable than gold out here in their own way. They remind us where we came from, what we're returning to eventually. But Jim isn't sure about that last part anymore. After a year in the mountains, the idea of returning to St. Louis feels strange, almost threatening. Would he fit back into civilization? Would he want to? The wilderness has shaped him into something new, something that might not have a place in the tame world of streets and buildings. The rendezvous stretches on for 2 weeks, and Jim experiences time in a strange, suspended way. Days blur together in a haze of conversation, competition, eating, and drinking. He makes friends, makes enemies, learns which trappers to trust and which to avoid. He hears stories that will become part of mountain legend, tales of grisly encounters, of escapes from hostile warriors, of beaver streams so rich a man could make his fortune in a single season if he could only survive long enough to trap them. And he learns to appreciate silence again. After days of constant noise and activity, he finds himself walking to the edge of the gathering, sitting alone and watching the sun set behind the mountains. The quiet feels profound after so much sound, and he understands that he's changed in ways he's still discovering. He's comfortable with solitude now in a way he never was before. The wilderness has taught him that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, that sometimes silence is its own kind of companionship. As the rendezvous winds down and small parties of trappers begin dispersing to their chosen territories for the upcoming season, Jim feels both reluctance and eagerness. Reluctance to leave this temporary community, eagerness to get back to the work, the solitude, the particular satisfaction of succeeding in a place that tries daily to kill you. Allow your breathing to deepen as you drift toward the next chapter. Let's follow Jim Bridger into his second year as a mountain man. It's September of 1824, and he's part of a small brigade, just 5 men, heading north toward the Three Forks of the Missouri River, a region rich with beaver but also dangerous. This is Blackfeet territory, and the Blackfeet Confederacy, comprising the Piegan, Blood, and Blackfeet proper, have made clear they don't welcome white trappers in their land. There have been incidents, bloody encounters that have left men dead on both sides, and the tension is palpable as Jim's brigade pushes into this contested region. Jim is different now from the green kid who left St. Louis. His body has been stripped of soft flesh, leaving only muscle and sinew and bone. His hands are scarred from 100 small accidents with knives and traps. His face has been darkened by sun and wind, aged beyond his 19 years. When he looks at his reflection in still water, he barely recognizes himself. The brigade leader is a man named Etienne Provet, a French-Canadian with 20 years of experience and a reputation for pushing into dangerous territory for the best trapping. Provet believes that risk and reward are proportional. The more dangerous the location, the less it's been trapped, the richer the take. Jim admires Provet's confidence while also fearing his recklessness. But he's signed on for the season, so he follows where Provet leads. They establish a base camp in a hidden valley, well protected from wind and invisible from any high point. This is essential in Blackfeet country. You want to be as inconspicuous as possible. They build a small log shelter for their supplies and pelts, and each man spreads out to trap his own section of stream. Jim claims a creek that flows through a dense willow thicket, the kind of place beaver love for the easy building material and protection from predators. The work falls into a familiar rhythm. Jim rises before dawn, eats a quick breakfast of whatever's available, usually fried salt pork and cornmeal mush, washed down with coffee so strong it makes his heart race. Then he walks his trap line, checking each set, removing caught beaver, resetting empty traps, always alert for signs of other humans. The work is meditative in its repetition, but also demands constant attention. A trap can malfunction, a beaver can escape, you can surprise a bear feeding on carrion, or you might turn a corner and find 3 Blackfeet warriors as startled to see you as you are to see them. The autumn colors are extraordinary this year. The aspens turn gold, then deeper gold, then a yellow so bright it seems to generate its own light. The oaks, scrubby mountain oaks, turn crimson. The cottonwoods add their own yellow to the palette. Jim finds himself stopping sometimes just to look, to take in the visual richness of a mountainside covered in turning leaves. It feels almost wasteful to notice beauty when there's work to do, but he can't help himself. One evening, checking his furthest trap in fading light, Jim shoots a grouse with his rifle. It's a clean shot, taking the bird's head off, leaving the body intact for eating. Grouse was a staple of the mountain man's diet when available. The meat is dark and rich, somewhere between chicken and duck in flavor. Jim plucks the bird as he walks back to camp, letting the feathers drift on the evening breeze. Back at camp, Provet shows him how to prepare it properly. You gut it carefully, preserving the liver and heart, then stuff the cavity with wild onions and sage. Wrapped in wet clay and buried in coals, the bird cooks slowly, the clay hardening into a shell. When you crack the clay open an hour later, the feathers stick to it, and you're left with perfectly cooked, herb-infused meat. The technique is ancient. Various cultures have been clay-baking birds for thousands of years, but it feels like magic every time. They eat the grouse with their fingers, tearing off pieces of the tender meat, and Jim thinks it might be the best thing he's ever tasted. Funny how deprivation makes everything more delicious, how simple food becomes a feast when you're genuinely hungry and tired. October brings the first serious snows, and Jim knows they're running out of time before winter locks down the mountains again. His pelt count is good, nearly 50 beaver already, plus some mink and marten he's caught opportunistically. But Provet is pushing for more, urging them to stay out longer, to keep trapping even as the weather deteriorates. One afternoon, Jim finds something unusual in his trap. Not a beaver but a river otter, sleek and beautiful even in death. Otter pelts are valuable, worth more than beaver because they're rarer and the fur is particularly soft and luxurious. But Jim feels a pang of guilt looking at the otter's face, its whiskers still wet, its eyes still bright. Otters are playful creatures, and Jim has watched them sometimes, sliding down muddy banks into water, seemingly doing it for the pure joy of the motion. But sentiment doesn't keep you alive in the mountains, and he takes the pelt. Back at camp, while skinning the otter with the careful precision that's become second nature, Jim notices Provet preparing something interesting. He's making what he calls coureurs de bois candy, a mixture of maple sugar, bear fat, and dried wild cherries, heated together until it combines, then poured onto a flat rock to cool. The result is a hard, sweet confection that provides dense calories and doesn't spoil. The voyagers had been making variations of this for over a century, creating portable sweetness for their long canoe journeys across Canada. Each piece is small, maybe the size of a walnut, but packed with energy. Jim tucks several pieces into his possible bag for the days when he's out on his trap line and needs a quick boost. The candy has a complex flavor, the sweetness of maple, the slight funkiness of bear fat, the tart punch of wild cherries. It's nothing like the refined confections you'd buy in a St. Louis shop, but it has its own rough charm, and the immediate energy it provides is undeniable. Sugar, Jim has learned, is power in the wilderness. It's calories in concentrated form, and calories are the currency of survival. November arrives with a serious cold. The streams are freezing along their edges, which makes trapping difficult but not impossible. Jim has learned to break the ice to set his traps, working with cold-numbed fingers, moving quickly before the water refreezes. The beavers are less active now, preparing for winter, but they still need to maintain their dams and lodges, which means they're still catchable. One morning, Jim's furthest trap is gone. Not sprung, not empty, completely gone, pulled free from its stake with enough force to bend the iron. He follows the drag marks through the snow and finds the trap 100 yards downstream empty. Whatever took it was powerful enough to pull free with the trap attached, then smart enough to eventually work itself loose. Jim suspects a wolverine, though he never sees the animal. Wolverines are rare in these mountains but notorious for their strength and cunning. The mountain men call them devil bears, and consider them both bad luck and worthy opponents. The lost trap is a financial blow. Traps cost several dollars each, and Jim can't afford to lose many. But it's also a reminder that he's not the only one trying to survive out here, that the wilderness is full of creatures pursuing their own interests, indifferent to human economy and ambition. As November deepens, Provitt finally agrees it's time to head back to winter quarters. They've done well. Collectively, the 5 men have nearly 300 pelts, which represents a good season's work. They cache the pelts carefully, bundling them in waterproof rawhide and burying them in a location they mark carefully but inconspicuously. The pelts will stay frozen and safe until spring, when they can be retrieved and transported to rendezvous. The journey back to their winter camp takes a week through deteriorating weather. They're traveling light, having cached their pelts and most equipment, carrying only immediate necessities. Jim walks in snowshoes now, the trail too deep for normal travel. Snowshoes are another skill he's learned: how to walk with the rolling, hip-swinging gait that distributes weight across the broad surface, how to climb slopes without slipping backward, how to travel for hours without tangling your feet and falling. They're 2 days from winter camp when they find the burned-out shelter. It's clearly been a trapper's camp. Jim can see the remains of a log structure, now collapsed and charred, and scattered around it are the unmistakable signs of violence. There are bodies, 3 of them, frozen in the snow and partially consumed by scavengers. They've been scalped and their equipment stripped away. Blackfeet work, Provitt says quietly, reading the sign. Maybe a week old. They bury the bodies as best they can, scraping shallow graves in the frozen ground and covering them with stones to keep the animals away. Jim doesn't know if the dead men would have cared about burial, but it feels important to do it anyway, to mark their passing with some ceremony. One of the bodies is wearing a medal, a saint's medal on a leather thong, and Jim recognizes it as something French-Canadian trappers often wear. He leaves it with the body, even though it might be worth something. That night, camped in a defensive position with one man always on watch, they eat a somber meal. Provitt has produced a small amount of preserved fruit, wild plums that he dried last summer and has been carrying carefully. They're wrinkled and dark, but when you bite into one, the sweetness is intense, almost shocking. Preserved fruit was precious on the frontier. The process of drying took time and care, and the result was portable sweetness that wouldn't spoil. For voyagers and trappers, dried fruit served multiple purposes. It provided vitamin C to prevent scurvy, offered quick energy from natural sugars, and provided psychological comfort through sweetness during hard times. Jim eats his portion slowly, thinking about the dead men, wondering if they enjoyed similar small pleasures in their last days. The wilderness gives and takes with equal indifference, he's learning. One day you're eating dried plums and watching snow fall gently through pine trees, and the next you're dead and freezing in a burned-out shelter. The trick is to appreciate the plums while you can. They reach winter camp without further incident, and Jim settles into the familiar routine of winter survival. This year is easier than the last. He knows what to expect, knows how to pace himself through the long cold months, knows which discomforts are temporary and which require immediate action. His feet don't freeze as easily because he's learned to change his socks daily, hanging the damp hair by the fire to dry. His hands are in better shape because he's learned to keep them active, flexing his fingers constantly to maintain circulation. Christmas comes, and again they try to make it special. Someone has shot a mountain goat, and they roast it whole over a pit fire, the meat becoming tender and mild, quite different from the gamey flavor of venison or elk. Mountain goat hunting is dangerous work. The animals live on cliff faces at high altitudes, but the meat is a delicacy, and the hide makes excellent leather, soft and supple even without extensive processing. For dessert, they make something Jim has never tried before: snow ice cream. You take clean, fresh snow, mix it with a bit of sugar and whatever fat you have available, and whip it together until it achieves a frozen, creamy consistency. It's not sophisticated, but it's cold and sweet and unexpected, and sitting in a shelter while wind howls outside, eating something frozen by choice rather than by accident, feels like a small triumph over winter. As you relax more deeply, feeling the warmth of that roasted goat, the cold sweetness of snow ice cream on your tongue, let your mind drift gently into the next chapter. The sound of dripping water is what wakes Jim in March of 1825. Not the sudden waking of danger, but a gradual emergence into consciousness, drawn upward by the musical sound of snowmelt dripping from the shelter's roof. He lies in his bedroll, listening, and knows without opening his eyes that winter is finally releasing its grip. There's something soothingly interesting about this transition, the way winter doesn't end so much as soften, becoming porous, letting warmth seep in at the edges before the whole structure collapses into spring. Jim's second mountain winter has been easier than his first, though easier is relative. He's still cold, still hungry much of the time, still counting the days until warmth returns. But he knows now that the cold will end, that survival is possible, that there's a rhythm to mountain life, and if you can just hold on through winter, spring always arrives eventually. By April, the streams are running high with meltwater, too high and violent for trapping but perfect for the beavers who ride the current and begin their spring activities. Jim and the brigade spend these weeks in camp, repairing equipment, sewing new moccasins, preparing for the spring hunt. They're also eating better. Game is more abundant as animals emerge from winter, and there are new foods available as plants begin their growing season. One afternoon, one of the trappers, a Shawnee man named Peter who's been with the brigade all winter, returns from scouting with a bag full of something green. They're wild greens, he explains, the first growth of spring, and after months of nothing but meat and cornmeal, they're as valuable as gold. Peter shows them which plants are safe to eat: miner's lettuce, dandelion greens, wild onion shoots, watercress from the creek edges. They boil the greens into a pot of water with a bit of salt pork for flavor, and the resulting soup is bitter and slightly metallic, but it tastes like life itself, like green growing things and the end of winter. Indigenous peoples across North America had sophisticated knowledge of wild edible plants, understanding not just which were safe but when to harvest them for optimal nutrition. Spring greens provided essential vitamins after winter's meat-heavy diet, preventing scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. The mountain men, learning from native teachers, adopted this knowledge eagerly. Jim finds he can't eat enough of the greens. His body craves them with an intensity that surprises him, as if some deep nutritional deficit is finally being addressed. He eats until his stomach aches, then eats more, and that night he sleeps deeply, his body processing the influx of plant nutrients it's been missing for months. By late April, the streams have calmed enough for trapping to resume, and the brigade disperses once more to their territories. Jim returns to his creeks and finds them transformed by spring. The willows are leafing out, the first wildflowers are blooming in sheltered spots, and the beavers are everywhere, busy with spring maintenance on their dams and lodges. He catches 3 beavers in his first morning and knows it's going to be a good season. But spring in the mountains brings its own dangers. The high water means crossing streams is risky, and Jim has several close calls, swept off his feet by current and only barely catching himself before being carried downstream. The flooding also means the wildlife is more concentrated on higher ground, which means more competition for territory. Jim sees his first grizzly of the season, a massive male, recently emerged from hibernation and hungry enough to be dangerous. Jim gives it a wide berth, climbing a tree and waiting an hour for the bear to move on. He's heard too many stories about grisly encounters that end badly to take any chances. One morning in May, checking a trap in a particularly dense thicket, Jim encounters Pine Leaf again. She's checking her own trap line, and this time they're close enough to talk. Her English is broken, his crow is non-existent, but they manage to communicate with a mixture of words, signs, and gestures. She shows him a method of constructing deadfall traps for small game, a figure-4 trigger system that requires no metal parts, just carefully shaped sticks and a heavy rock. Jim is impressed by the engineering, the way she can create a functional trap from materials lying on the ground, and he tries to memorize the process so he can replicate it later. In return, he shares his lunch, pemmican and hardtack, washed down with cold creek water. Pine Leaf accepts the food politely but without enthusiasm, and Jim understands that his trail food is probably inferior to what she's used to. Still, they eat together, sitting on a fallen log with sun warming their shoulders and snowmelt gurgling past their feet, and Jim feels a connection that transcends language. 2 people doing the same work in the same place, acknowledging each other's competence and right to be there. Before parting, Pine Leaf gives him something, a small leather pouch filled with what looks like a course meal. She makes gestures that he interprets as add to meat or add to stew, and then she's gone, moving through the forest with that enviable silence. That night, Jim adds some of the meal to his dinner pot where he's boiling beaver tail and wild onions. The meal thickens the stew and adds a nutty, slightly sweet flavor. It's camas flour, he realizes, made from those roots the Shoshone women were cooking at last year's rendezvous, dried and ground into meal. It transforms his simple stew into something more substantial, more satisfying, and he eats it gratefully, thinking about the gift of food from someone who probably has little to spare. June brings the retrieval of cached pelts and preparation for the journey to rendezvous. This year's gathering is set for Henry's Fork of the Green River, several weeks' travel south. Jim's brigade unearths their cache, and Jim is relieved to find his pelts in perfect condition, frozen solid over winter, now thawing and supple, each one representing income and validation. The journey south is less urgent than last year's trip, and Jim finds himself actually enjoying the travel. They move through a country he's never seen before, high desert plateau land where sage grows in silver-green waves and the sky seems to occupy more space than the earth. At night, they camp near springs or seasonal streams, and the sound of horses grazing and men talking quietly becomes the soundtrack of early summer. One evening, they stop at a trading post, barely more than a cabin, where a French trader has established himself. The trader has actual vegetables, grown in a small irrigated garden, lettuce, radishes, young onions. They're the first cultivated vegetables Jim has seen in 2 years, and the trader wants outrageous prices for them. Jim trades a mink pelt, worth $3, for a radish and 2 young onions, and knows he's being cheated but doesn't care. He eats the radish immediately, biting into its crisp, peppery flesh, and the taste is so bright and clean and civilized that his eyes water. The onions he saves for dinner, slicing them thinly into a pot of boiled beans, and their sharp sweetness transforms the meal completely. Cultivated vegetables were rare luxuries in the Mountain West. The growing season was short, irrigation required significant labor, and the gardens were vulnerable to wildlife and weather. But for trappers accustomed to wild foods and preserved rations, fresh vegetables represented a connection to the settled world, a reminder that somewhere far away, people grew food in orderly rows and ate salads and didn't constantly worry about freezing or starving. They arrive at a rendezvous in late June, and Jim is struck by how much larger it is than last year's informal gathering. There are at least 500 people here, maybe more, and the supply caravan from St. Louis has brought an astonishing array of goods. Jim wanders through the temporary market, looking at items he hasn't seen in 2 years: real coffee, sugar, tobacco, bolts of cloth, ready-made shirts, ribbons and beads for trading with Indians, iron tools, books, even a few bottles of actual whiskey rather than the raw frontier alcohol that usually passes for spirits. But what catches Jim's attention more than any merchandise is the food. A group of traders has brought supplies for making real bread, not just bannock but risen bread made with yeast. They've built outdoor ovens from stone and clay, and the smell of baking bread drifts across the entire rendezvous site. Jim buys a loaf, trading a beaver pelt for it, and doesn't care that he's overpaying. The bread is still warm, and when he tears into it, steam rises and the interior is soft and light, nothing like the dense trail breads he's been eating. He eats half the loaf immediately, standing right there in the market, and saves the other half for later, though he knows it'll be stale by evening. That doesn't matter. For a few hours, he has real bread, and that's enough. There's also someone making pies, actual pies with crust and filling, from dried apples and wild berries. Jim has no money left after buying necessary supplies, so he trades work for a slice of pie, spending an afternoon hauling water for the pie maker's camp. The pie, when he finally gets it, is small and the crust is tough and the filling is more tart than sweet. But it's pie, a food from the civilized world, and eating it feels like a small act of defiance against the wilderness's indifference. The rendezvous lasts 3 weeks this year, and Jim participates fully, competing in shooting matches, losing money gambling, drinking too much bad whiskey and regretting it, dancing awkwardly at evening gatherings, arguing about politics and routes and whether the beaver population can sustain current trapping levels. He reconnects with men he met last year, learns that 2 of them died over the winter, hears rumors about new territories opening up, new dangers emerging. And he makes a decision. When the rendezvous breaks up and men form brigades for the coming year, Jim signs on with a party heading west toward the Snake River country, deeper into the mountains than he's been before. It's risky, unknown territory always is, but Jim has discovered something about himself over the past 2 years. He doesn't want to be safe. He wants to see what's beyond the next ridge, what's in the valleys that haven't been trapped yet, what the wilderness looks like when you push past the edges of the known world. As your consciousness drifts, feeling the warmth of that fresh bread, the sweetness of that hard-won pie, let yourself float gently into the final chapter. It's autumn of 1825, and Jim Bridger is farther from St. Louis than he's ever been, nearly 1,000 miles of mountain and desert and river between himself and anything resembling civilization. His new brigade, led by a taciturn man named Thomas Fitzpatrick, is working the Snake River drainage, a network of cold, fast streams that pour down from the Tetons and eventually feed into the Columbia River. This is country that few white men have seen, and Jim understands he's participating in something historic, pushing the boundaries of the known world, even if that knowledge will only be preserved in surveyors' maps and fur company records. The trapping is extraordinary. These streams haven't been worked before, and the beaver are so plentiful that Jim sometimes catches 3 or 4 in a single morning. His pelt count grows rapidly, and he begins to imagine what such a haul will be worth next summer at Rendezvous. Maybe enough to buy real equipment, a good horse of his own, maybe even enough to go back to St. Louis for a visit, see his mother, walk on actual streets again. But the wealth comes with constant awareness of danger. This is Blackfeet country, and also territory claimed by the Bannock and Northern Shoshone, and the various tribes aren't always friendly with each other or with trappers. The brigade camps defensively every night, always with guards posted, always with rifles close at hand. They travel in tight formation, never stringing out, always able to circle and defend if necessary. One October afternoon, Jim is working a creek alone when he sees smoke in the distance. Too much smoke to be a campfire, too organized to be a wildfire. He works his way carefully toward it and discovers a Bannock camp, perhaps 20 lodges, settled in a meadow near good water. He watches from concealment for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do. The smart thing would be to slip away unnoticed and report the camp's location to Fitzpatrick. But he's also curious, and after 2 years in the mountains he's learned that not every encounter with Indians ends in violence. He stands, makes sure his rifle is visible but pointed down, and walks slowly toward the camp. Dogs spot him first and set up a commotion, and within moments he's surrounded by warriors with weapons ready. But no one attacks, and Jim keeps his hands visible and empty, trying to project peaceful intent even though his heart is hammering so hard he can feel it in his throat. An older man pushes through the crowd and looks at Jim with assessing eyes. Then, surprisingly, he smiles and makes a gesture of welcome. It turns out the Bannock leader remembers Fitzpatrick from years before, some positive interaction that Jim never learns the details of, and based on that memory, the trappers are considered friendly. Jim is invited into the camp and finds himself sitting in a lodge, trying to communicate through signs and the few words of trade language he's picked up. The Bannock women bring food, and Jim experiences hospitality that humbles him. There's roasted elk, tender and seasoned with herbs he can't identify. There's a kind of bread made from ground seeds and baked on hot stones, nutty and substantial. And there's a stew that contains what looks like insects, grasshoppers, he realizes, roasted until crispy and then added to a thick soup with wild vegetables. Grasshoppers and other insects have been important food sources for many cultures throughout history, providing complete protein and requiring far less effort to harvest than large game. The Romans considered grasshoppers a delicacy, and many indigenous American groups harvested them seasonally, often using fire to drive massive swarms into collection areas. Jim eats everything offered, knowing that refusal would be insulting. The grasshopper stew is actually good, crunchy texture, nutty flavor from the roasted insects, rich broth. He finds himself going back for seconds, and the Bannock women seem pleased by his appetite. Before he leaves, loaded down with gifts of food for the brigade, the elder shows Jim something special, a small pot of honey that the Bannock collected during summer. Wild honey is precious in the mountains, and the elder explains through signs that this particular honey comes from flowers that bloom near hot springs, giving it a unique mineral quality. Jim tastes it on his finger, sweet and slightly sulfurous, strange but not unpleasant, and thanks the elder with as much grace as he can muster. He returns to the brigade's camp at dusk, and Fitzpatrick listens to his account of the Bannock camp without comment. Then, pragmatically, Fitzpatrick asks what food they gave him. When Jim shows the elk meat, the seed bread, and explains about the grasshopper stew. Fitzpatrick nods. Good. That means they're well-fed, which means they're less likely to raid us for supplies. Hungry tribes are dangerous tribes. It's a cynical assessment, but Jim has learned that survival in the mountains often requires setting aside sentiment in favor of pragmatism. Still, he finds himself thinking about the hospitality he received, the way the Bannock women made sure he had enough to eat, the elders' willingness to share precious honey. There are complexities to the relationship between trappers and Indians that simple categories of friendly or hostile don't capture. As autumn deepens toward winter, the brigade begins seeing signs of something unusual: strange tracks near hot springs, reports from other trappers of a valley where the ground is warm year-round and water shoots into the air from holes in the earth. Jim dismisses these stories as tall tales, the kind of exaggeration that trappers indulge in during long winter nights. But Fitzpatrick is intrigued, and in late November, instead of settling into winter quarters, he decides to investigate. They travel south and west, following increasingly bizarre reports, and eventually they find it, a landscape that seems torn from a fever dream. The ground steams even as snow falls. Water boils up from the earth in pools of impossible blue. Geysers erupt on regular schedules, throwing water and steam 100 feet into the air. Mud pots bubble and seethe, exhaling sulfurous gases. Jim stands at the edge of this alien landscape and understands he's seeing something extraordinary, something that will be hard to describe to anyone who hasn't witnessed it. This region, which will eventually be called Yellowstone, becomes the brigade's winter headquarters. The warm ground means they can dig into earth that isn't frozen solid, can build more substantial shelters than usual. The hot springs mean they can bathe in warm water, a luxury Jim hasn't experienced since leaving St. Louis. And the strange landscape attracts abundant game. Elk and bison gather in the warmer valleys, making hunting easier than in the frozen territories they've left behind. Jim's third mountain winter is almost comfortable, at least by mountain standards. They have plenty of game, decent shelter, and the psychological boost of warm water and geothermal heat. Jim even gains a bit of weight, filling out to something approaching his St. Louis build. And they have time, long stretches of time when the trapping is impossible but survival doesn't require constant vigilance, and Jim finds himself with hours to fill. He begins keeping a kind of journal, though his writing skills are limited. Using charcoal on scraped hide, he records what he sees: the date when a particular geyser erupts, the number of elk in different valleys, the plants growing near hot springs even in January. It's primitive record-keeping, but it helps him order his thoughts, helps him process the strangeness of what he's witnessing. Christmas arrives, and once again the brigade attempts celebration. They have genuine luxury this year. Someone shot a bison, and they roast the hump ribs, which are marbled with fat and become meltingly tender over slow coals. Bison hump was considered the finest cut, prized by trappers and Indians alike, and Jim understands why when he tastes it. The meat is rich without being gamey, the fat carrying flavors of sage and wild grass, and they feast until their bellies ache. For dessert, Fitzpatrick produces something remarkable: a small tin of actual white sugar, not maple or honey but refined cane sugar, precious as diamonds out here. They make snow cream again, but this time with real sugar, and the difference is astonishing. The snow melts slower, the sweetness is cleaner, brighter, and Jim eats his portion slowly, making it last, knowing he won't taste refined sugar again for months at least. Spring comes to Yellowstone dramatically. The snowmelt combines with geothermal runoff to create floods that reshape the landscape almost daily. Jim watches entire hillsides slide into valleys, watches new hot springs emerge where none existed before, watches the earth remake itself with casual violence. It's beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The spring hunt is productive, and by June the brigade has accumulated enough pelts that they need extra pack animals just to transport them to rendezvous. Jim has over 90 pelts of his own, plus the wages he's accumulated, and he calculates that he's worth nearly $500, more wealth than he ever imagined possessing. The journey to rendezvous takes 6 weeks through country. Jim is learning to read like a familiar text. He notices changes from previous years, trails that are more worn, trees marked by previous travelers, places where camps have been established and then abandoned. The wilderness is becoming known territory, mapped and measured and incorporated into the expanding American frontier. Jim isn't sure how he feels about this. Part of him mourns the loss of the truly unknown, the unexplored. But part of him appreciates the increasing safety, the knowledge that he's not entirely alone in this vast landscape. Rendezvous 1826 is held at Cache Valley again, and Jim is shocked by how commercial it's become. There are professional traders now, not just company men but independent merchants who've traveled from St. Louis specifically to sell goods at inflated prices to trappers desperate for supplies and willing to spend freely after a year of deprivation. There are games of chance run by professional gamblers. There are women from various tribes offering various services. There's a temporary economy that springs up and flourishes for 3 weeks, then dissolves as everyone disperses for another year. Jim trades his pelts, pays his debts, buys next year's supplies, and finds he still has money left over, actual coins, silver dollars that feel strange and wonderful in his hand. He walks through the market, looking at things he could buy now that he has money. There's a pocket watch, which would be useful for timing geyser eruptions. There's a proper knife with a brass guard and stag handle. There are books, though Jim's reading skills aren't strong enough to make books particularly useful. What he finally buys is food, specifically luxury food that serves no practical purpose but satisfies something deeper than hunger. He buys a small jar of strawberry preserves, shipped from the East at enormous cost. He buys real coffee, not the chicory mixture they usually drink but actual coffee beans, dark and aromatic. He buys a lemon, shriveled from the journey but still a lemon, the first citrus he's seen in 3 years. And he buys sugar cookies, baked by a trader's wife, simple butter cookies with sugar crystals on top that catch the light like tiny jewels. He takes these treasures back to his camp and shares them with his brigade mates. They spread strawberry preserves on bannock bread and eat it reverently. They brew coffee properly, taking time to enjoy the aroma as much as the taste. They divide the lemon carefully, each man getting a segment to suck on, faces puckering at the tartness but smiling nonetheless. And they eat the cookies one at a time, making a single cookie last 5 minutes, talking about where they'll trap next year, what they'll do with their money, whether they'll eventually return to civilization or stay in the mountains until the mountains kill them. Jim thinks about his mother during this meal. He's written her 2 letters in 3 years, short and stilted because writing doesn't come easily to him. He wonders if she's received them, if she knows he's alive and reasonably prosperous. He wonders if he should go back to St. Louis, see her, reassure her that her son survived the wilderness. But even as he thinks it, he knows he won't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The mountains have claimed him in ways he's still discovering, and the thought of returning to streets and buildings and the press of civilization makes him anxious in a way that facing down a grizzly never does. As the rendezvous winds down and Jim prepares for another year in the mountains, his fourth, though it feels like he's been doing this forever, he realizes something that would have shocked the 19-year-old who left St. Louis. He's happy. Not constantly, not without difficulty, not without danger and cold and hunger, but happy in a fundamental way, doing work that makes sense to him in a place that feels, against all logic, like home. He's become what he set out to become, a mountain man, someone who can survive where survival seems impossible, who can find beauty in harsh places, who can sit by a fire eating a sugar cookie and watching stars emerge in a sky so vast it makes him feel both infinitely small and somehow significant. And that, he thinks, licking sugar from his fingers while his friends tell lies about next year's plans, is enough. More than enough. It's everything. And now, dear friend, our journey through blood, ice, and timber comes to a gentle close. You've traveled with Jim Bridger from the muddy docks of St. Louis to the geothermal wonders of Yellowstone, through seasons of cold and hunger and unexpected beauty. You've tasted salt pork and pemmican, maple sugar and wild honey, grasshopper stew and sugar cookies bought with hard-earned silver. You've felt the cold of mountain streams, the warmth of fire, the particular satisfaction of work done well in a place that demands everything and promises nothing. I hope these stories carried you gently towards sleep, that somewhere in the telling you drifted off to dreams of mountains and beaver streams and the kind of life that seems impossible until someone lives it. If this quiet journey helped you unwind, if you found yourself breathing more slowly as the story unfolded, if you're reading this in the morning having slept through most of it, well, that's exactly what I hoped for. If you'd like to let me know where you drifted off, or which chapter carried you into sleep, feel free to leave a comment below. And if you found this journey restful, if you think someone else might enjoy these gentle wanderings through history, consider liking and subscribing. But only if it feels right. No pressure. Just an invitation. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. Thank you for trusting me with your quiet evening, your journey towards sleep, your willingness to drift into the past. Sweet dreams, friends. May your sleep be as deep as winter snow, as peaceful as a mountain dawn, as restful as a fire burning low while stars wheel overhead. Good night.